"He's perfect." "Amara," Osei whispered into the dark. Not to anyone in particular, just to the room, just to the fact of him. And then Kofi's small mouth found what it was looking for, and the apartment went quiet again except for the soft, rhythmic sounds of a 6-month-old who had no idea what time it was and would not have cared if he did. It was 4:47 in the morning, and Amara had been awake since 4:15, which was itself a generous estimate, because the sleep she had managed between midnight and 4 had been the shallow, one-ear-open kind that doesn't really count. The kind that leaves you technically rested and actually exhausted in a way that lives somewhere below the body, somewhere that no amount of sleep can reach, because it isn't tiredness, it is love, and love at this particular stage of it doesn't let you fully go. She sat in the nursing chair by the window with her feet tucked beneath her, and the city's pre-dawn quiet pressing softly against the glass, and she held Kofi against her chest and felt the specific, irreplaceable weight of him, his jaw working steadily, his small fist curled against her collarbone, his breathing settling into the deep, even rhythm that meant he was going back under, going back to wherever babies go when the world becomes too much effort to be in. And she thought, as she thought every single morning in this chair, that she had never in her life understood the word everything until she understood him. He had Dominic's jaw and her mother's nose, and a temperament that swung without warning between pure angelic contentment and something that could generously be described as operatic, and she loved every version of him with a completeness that still occasionally stopped her in the middle of ordinary moments and made her have to put something down and just breathe. The baby bag sat on the kitchen counter, packed for the 3rd time since midnight because the first 2 times she had been convinced she was forgetting something. The white noise machine, no, she'd put that in first. The backup formula, yes, that was in the outer pocket. The small elephant rattle he couldn't sleep without. Yes, it was there, and she had unpacked it both times just to confirm and repacked it with the precise, methodical focus of someone who has decided that this particular anxiety can be solved by thoroughness, even when it cannot. She was tired in the way only new mothers understand, not the tiredness of having worked hard, but the tiredness of having given something of yourself continuously without pause for 6 months, and having discovered that the giving doesn't deplete you the way you expected it to. It transforms you instead, and the transformation is beautiful and exhausting in equal measure, and you wouldn't undo a single hour of it even when you would very much like to sleep. Dominic appeared in the bedroom doorway at 4:58, already dressed, 2 mugs of coffee held easily in one hand, watching her with the particular expression he got in these early mornings, quiet, unhurried. The warmth in his eyes, something he had stopped trying to contain years ago because she could always see it anyway. "You've checked the bag 3 times, he said low enough not to wake Kofi fully. "I'm going to check it a 4th, she said, and she meant it. He didn't argue. He sat on the arm of the chair beside her and handed her the coffee, and they stayed like that for a while. The 3 of them in the pre-dawn quiet, while the city outside decided whether it was ready to become itself again. Something felt different about this trip. Amara thought, not wrong, just different, the way certain mornings have a texture that doesn't quite match the calendar. She couldn't name it, so she set it aside because Kofi had fallen back to sleep against her collarbone with the absolute commitment to unconsciousness that only the very young can achieve. And the coffee was warm, and Dominic was beside her, and some feelings are better held than examined before 5 a.m. Hartsfield Jackson at 6:40 in the morning had the particular energy of a place that has been running all night and has simply decided not to acknowledge it. The lights too bright, the coffee lines already long, the travelers moving through security with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this enough times that their bodies know the sequence before their minds do. Shoes off, laptop out, baby carrier removed and sent through separately, while Amara held Kofi against her hip, and he regarded the security scanner with the focused, wide-eyed attention he gave everything new in the world, which was still, at 6 months, almost everything. Amara's passport, tucked into the side pocket of her carry-on, had stamps from Tokyo and London and Lagos and Singapore. Evidence of who she had been before Kofi, a corporate attorney who moved through the world with the kind of precision that made other people feel slightly disorganized. And she was not that person right now, standing in the security line with formula in the outer pocket of her bag and a burp cloth draped over her shoulder. But she was not entirely different from her either, and she was beginning to understand that motherhood was less a transformation than an expansion, that you didn't stop being who you were, you simply became capable of containing more. At the gate, Dominic kissed her forehead and told her he needed to make a call and would catch up before boarding. She didn't think anything of it. His calls were a constant, familiar texture of their life. Quiet, clipped, the kind where he said very little and the person on the other end understood everything, and she had long since stopped trying to decode them and had instead come to find them oddly comforting, the way you find comforting the things that are reliably, consistently themselves. She found a seat near the window and settled Kofi into the carrier and watched the planes move on the tarmac with the slow, deliberate grace of enormous animals, and for about 8 minutes she did not think about the bag or the formula or whether she'd remembered the pediatrician's note about altitude and ear pressure, and those 8 minutes were very nearly enough to make her feel human again. The boarding call for first class came, and Amara stood and gathered her things with the automatic efficiency of someone who has learned to move through airports without thinking too hard about any of it. And the gate agent scanned her pass and then paused just a fraction of a second, barely anything, and smiled. "You're in 2A today, Mrs. O.C. Enjoy your flight." Amara looked at the boarding pass. Then she looked at it again. Seat 2A. First class. The wide leather seats, the real champagne, the extra 12 inches of everything that Dominic knew she would never book for herself because she would never spend money that way, which was precisely why he always did it for her. She understood immediately. He had upgraded her. Of course he had. She felt the warmth of it move through her chest. Not surprise, because he always did things like this, but gratitude that had never once become routine in 4 years, the particular gratitude of being known well enough that someone anticipates the thing you wouldn't have asked for. She boarded and settled into the wide seat and buckled Kofi into the carrier against her chest and exhaled for what felt like the first time since she had gotten out of bed. A real exhale, the kind that loosens the place between your shoulder blades and reminds your body that it is allowed to take up space. A flight attendant passed through, taking pre-departure orders, young pleasant name tag reading Denise, and she smiled at Kofi and told Amara he was absolutely gorgeous. Amara thanked her with the particular warmth she reserved for people who were kind to her son, which was a warmth that came from somewhere deeper than politeness. Through the gap in the galley curtain just for a moment, Amara caught a glimpse of another flight attendant, platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, rigid posture, scanning something on the cabin manifest with the focused intensity of someone conducting an inspection rather than preparing a service. Then the curtain swung closed and Amara looked away, and Kofi made a soft, sleepy sound against her chest, and she closed her eyes and let herself rest. Claire Whitmore had been a flight attendant for 23 years, which was long enough to have developed opinions about almost everything and certainties about several things that she had no business being certain about. And she wore both with the ease of someone who has never been seriously required to examine them. She had worked her way from the back of the plane to the front, from economy to business to first class over the course of 2 decades. And she treated that progression the way certain people treat any kind of elevation, as evidence of a natural order, as confirmation that she had arrived somewhere she deserved to be, and that the people already there were people like her, and that the people who were not like her were by definition somewhere else. Her platinum blonde hair was always in a severe bun on duty pulled back, with the kind of tightness that suggested discipline and communicated something closer to control, and her uniform was always pressed, and her name tag was always straight. and her pre-flight ritual was always the same: establish hierarchy with the junior crew, review the manifest survey, the cabin decide who belonged. That last part was not in any employee handbook. It was not a policy. It was not something she had ever said out loud to anyone exactly. It was just a thing she did the way you do. The things you have done so many times they no longer feel like choices. The way you apply a judgment so automatically you've stopped noticing you're applying it at all. She walked out of the galley and scanned the cabin, and she saw Amara Ose in seat 2, a young black woman baby carrier diaper bag stowed in the overhead with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, and something in Claire Whitmore's face went rigid in a way that was not surprise, that was closer to confirmation of something she had already decided. She pulled Denise aside, asked who had checked in 2A. Denise told her the gate agent had handled it, that the boarding pass was first class, that everything was in order. Claire's jaw tightened in a way that Denise noticed and chose not to comment on, because she had worked with Claire long enough to know the particular landscape of that expression, and to understand that commenting on it would not improve it. "There's an infant in first class," Claire said. "She has a valid seat assignment," Denise said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. I can see that Claire said, "I'm just saying." But she was not just saying. She was calculating the way she always calculated when something in the cabin had registered on her internal manifest as wrong, which was the word she used for it privately, the word that covered a category of passengers she had never defined out loud, but had applied consistently for 23 years. She stepped away from Denise and checked her phone, a text from a number not saved under a real name. Just 2 initials, RV. And she read it, and something in her expression settled not into calm exactly, but into the practiced approximation of calm that she had developed over 2 decades of doing this job. The look that read as professionalism on the surface and was something considerably colder underneath. She put the phone away. She adjusted her bun. She straightened her already straight name tag. She checked the manifest one more time with the thoroughness of someone who needs to be certain before they proceed, and she looked at seat 2A and the name beside it, and she let out a breath that was not quite a sigh. Dominic boarded just before the doors closed, settling into a row behind Amara at the request of a colleague who needed to review a document before landing, which meant he was present without being visible to Claire, which meant that what was about to happen would happen with an audience he was part of, but that she did not know was there. Claire stepped to the galley threshold, looked out at the cabin, and let her eyes rest for just a moment on seat 2A, and the expression on her face in that particular instant, if anyone had been watching her rather than watching the planes pull back from the gate, would have been the first warning of everything that was coming. The seatbelt sign clicked off 40 minutes after takeoff, and Claire Whitmore moved. She moved with the sharp, purposeful stride of someone who had already made a decision and was not interested in reconsidering it out of the galley and down the aisle with the kind of momentum that other passengers unconsciously moved aside, for not because she asked them to, but because the force of her intention was a physical thing, something you felt before you understood it. Kofi had made one small sound, not a cry, barely even a murmur, the soft searching noise babies make when they are between sleep and wakefulness, drifting in and out of the warm half-consciousness of someone who has been fed and held and has nothing in the world to worry about. It was the kind of sound that would not have registered to anyone who wasn't specifically listening for it, and most people in the cabin had not been listening for it, and the ones who had heard it had already looked away and gone back to their screens. Claire had been listening. She came down the aisle and stopped directly beside seat 2A, and Amara looked up from adjusting Kofi's carrier. She had been half asleep herself, one hand resting on his back. The warmth of him, the most grounding thing she had felt all day. And the first thing she registered was not what Claire said, but what was in her face, which was not professionalism and not concern, and was not any of the things that belong in the face of someone whose job description involves ensuring the comfort of the people in these seats. What was in Claire Whitmore's face was fury, the tight, coiled, barely managed fury of someone who has been looking for a reason and has decided, finally, that they have found one. "I need you to quiet that child," Claire said. Not a question, not a request. A directive delivered the way you deliver directives to someone who has already failed to do what they were supposed to do. Amara blinked. She looked at Kofi, who was already drifting back to sleep, whose eyes were at half-mast, whose breathing was evening out again into the deep, unhurried rhythm of someone with nowhere to be. She looked back at Claire and kept her voice exactly as even as her mother had taught her to keep it, because her mother had spent 20 years teaching her that grace under pressure was its own form of power, and that the moment you let someone provoke you into raising your voice, you have given them exactly what they came for. "He's fine," Amara said. "He's going back to sleep." "This is first class," Claire said, and each word came out sharpened, deliberate, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the words themselves. "People pay a great deal of money to sit up here in peace and quiet." "I paid for this seat," Amara said. "Did you?" The question came out flat, not like a question at all, more like a verdict that had been reached before the trial began, and the people nearby began to notice Nora Beckwith in 4B looked up from her book, her finger pausing on the page mid-sentence. Devin Ashby in 3C took out one earbud and set down his phone. Philip Sato in 2C, directly beside Amara, kept his eyes fixed on his laptop screen, but the cursor had stopped moving, and he was not reading anything. Amara kept her hand steady on Kofi's back, kept her voice measured, kept her eyes on Claire's, and she said with the quiet, deliberate precision of someone who has decided not to be baited, but is also not going to pretend she doesn't understand what is happening. "Is there something specific you need from me? Or are you here to make sure I know that you don't think I should be sitting here?" The question landed. The people who were already watching leaned slightly forward. The people who had not yet been watching began to. Claire's eyes went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, a flatness that was calculated rather than spontaneous, the kind of cold that has been practiced rather than felt. And she leaned in, reducing the distance between them in the specific, deliberate way of someone who wants to make a point about proximity, about presence, about who has the power in this particular piece of space. And then she said it. "People like you don't belong up here." The words arrived in the cabin, and the cabin changed, not dramatically, not with any visible shift in the light or the temperature, but with the particular quality of a space, after something has been said that cannot be unsaid, the way a room feels after a door has been slammed when the sound has stopped, but the reverberations haven't. Even the ambient noise of the aircraft seemed to recede for just a moment, as though the plane itself registered the weight of what had been placed in the air between them. Amara stared at her. She had heard those words before, not always in those exact syllables, not always stripped down to that particular nakedness, not always delivered with such casual, unapologetic certainty as though they were simply a fact about the world rather than a choice about who gets to diminish whom. But she knew them, she knew their shape and their weight and the particular way they were designed to work, which was to reduce a person from everything they were to a category someone else had decided they fit into. She knew what they meant. She opened her mouth. She had something to say. She was about to say it. Devin Ashby's hand moved to his phone, not hastily, not in an obvious way, but with the quiet, practiced motion of a documentary filmmaker who has learned to start recording before the moment registers as a moment. Because by the time it registers, it is already half over, and his instincts developed over 15 years of this work were already telling him that whatever was about to happen in the next few seconds was going to matter. Nora Beckwith set her book face down in her lap, a complete, deliberate gesture. The gesture of a woman who has decided that what she is witnessing requires her full attention, and who has been in enough rooms in 63 years of living to know the difference between a conflict and something worse. Philip Sato's cursor stopped moving on his laptop screen. The document he had been working on remained open. He did not look up. He was aware of not looking up in the specific, self-conscious way of a person who knows they are choosing not to look up and is already somewhere below the surface beginning to feel the cost of that choice. Claire Whitmore raised her hand. She raised it and brought it down across Amara Osei's face, and the sound of it moved through the cabin like something physical, sharp and flat and absolutely unmistakable. The kind of sound that your body identifies before your mind does, that lands in the chest before it registers in the brain, that changes the nature of the air in the room simply by having occurred. Kofi startled awake. He went from the soft, searching half-sleep of a content 6-month-old to a full, high, frightened cry in the space of a single second. The cry of a baby who does not understand what happened but felt his mother's body react, felt the flinch that moved through her before she could stop it, and whose entire understanding of safety and danger at this point in his life is located entirely in the way her body feels when she holds him. Amara's hand went to her cheek. Her eyes went wide, not with tears, not yet, but with the pure animal shock of a person whose body has been violated, and whose mind is still working to catch up to what just happened to it, still running through the sequence in disbelief, because surely that could not have been what it was. Surely there is another explanation for the sound and the sting and the way the cabin has gone absolutely, completely still. The woman 2 rows back said, "Oh my God," in a voice that was barely above a murmur, but that carried perfectly in the silence. Devon's phone was recording. He had not moved anything else, had not shifted in his seat, or leaned forward, or done anything to draw attention to himself, but his phone was in his hand at an angle that captured the aisle clearly, and he had been recording for 31 seconds, and the footage was clear and steady and unambiguous. And he knew with the quiet certainty of someone who has documented things for a living that what was on his screen right now was going to matter enormously to a great many people very soon. Nora had risen slightly from her seat, not standing, not yet. But her posture had changed. Her body had moved into something more forward, more present, the instinctive positioning of someone who is deciding whether to act and has not quite decided but is getting there. Philip Sato had still not looked up. The document was still open on his laptop. The cursor had still not moved. He was listening to Kofi cry and listening to the silence of everyone around him and feeling somewhere he was not yet ready to examine the specific weight of what his stillness was costing. Claire stood in the aisle with the flat, unapologetic expression of someone who believes on some level that goes deeper than reasoning that she has done nothing wrong, or at least nothing that will have consequences, and the expression was so steady, so composed, so practiced that it was in some ways more disturbing than the slap itself. If you have ever watched a story unfold right in front of you and felt the specific helplessness of knowing you are witnessing something that should not be happening and not knowing what to do about it, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel, because every story we tell here is about what happens when ordinary people find themselves at the center of extraordinary moments and what they choose to do when it matters. Amara took 1 breath, then 2. She brought Kofi closer against her chest, pressing him gently into the space just below her collarbone, where the warmth of her was most immediate and the vibration of her heartbeat was closest to the surface, and she began the low, steady hum she had been using to settle him since his 3rd week of life, a sound she had never consciously decided to make, that had simply emerged one night when she had been running out of options and her body had offered this, and it had worked, and she had used it every time since, and she hummed it now with her cheek stinging and her hand trembling slightly, and the entire first-class cabin of Meridian Airways, Flight 2241, watching her, and within 40 seconds, Kofi's cry had softened into something that was more confusion than distress, and within a minute it had become the soft, searching murmur he always made when he was deciding whether to go back to sleep. She kept her hands steady on his back. She focused everything she had on keeping them steady. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet it was almost frightening, the particular kind of quiet that means the opposite of stillness, that means the thing being held is enormous, and is being held very deliberately. "You just hit me," she said. "With my baby in my arms." Claire didn't answer. She had already begun the retreat back into the performance of authority. Straightening her posture, composing her expression, retreating behind the name tag and the uniform and the 23 years of seniority, as though they were a structure she could hide behind, as though what she had just done could be reabsorbed into the architecture of her role, if she simply moved back into it quickly enough. Nora Beckwith stood. She stood up from seat 4B with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a woman who has made a decision and is not going to rush it. And she addressed Claire directly using her name from the name tag, and her voice was not loud, but it had the absolute grounded steadiness of someone who spent 30 years in hospital rooms, where steadiness was not optional. The voice of a retired nurse who has delivered difficult information and held frightened hands and decided long ago that the most important thing she can do in any room is tell the truth clearly. She said she had witnessed what had just occurred, that she was documenting it, that she intended to report it through every channel available to her, and that she would like to know the procedure for doing so on this aircraft. Claire turned to Nora with a look that expanded the radius of her hostility outward. A look that said clearly without words that Nora had just added herself to a list, and she told her in a voice designed to be heard by the rows nearby that Nora would now be the last person in this cabin she served. The threat was intended to chill, and it did. Philip Sato, who had been on the absolute trembling edge of speaking, looked back down at his laptop, and the cursor still didn't move, and the document was still open, and the cost of his silence was accumulating in a way he could feel but was not yet ready to name. Devon was still recording. He had been recording for 53 seconds. The angle was clean and unobstructed and covered the aisle from rows 2 through 5, and everything that had happened in the last minute was on it, in full, without ambiguity, without interpretation. Just the sequence, just the truth, just the thing itself, exactly as it had occurred. Amara, through all of it, had not looked away from Kofi. She had been counting his breaths, grounding herself in the specific, familiar weight of him in the small fist that had found her finger again, without her noticing, in the sound of him settling back toward sleep as though the world were still safe, as though the thing that had just happened had not happened, as though his mother's arms were still the whole of everything that mattered. They were. She was going to make sure they remained that way. And then the intercom crackled, the sound of it cutting through the cabin like a second shock electronic and sudden and impossible to ignore, and every head in the cabin turned toward the nearest speaker, and even Kofi quieted for a moment as though he too understood that something significant was about to be said. The voice that came through was deep and completely even. The voice of a man who had been in boardrooms during crises and courtrooms during challenges, and had learned over many years and many rooms that the most powerful thing he could do in any of them was keep his voice exactly this calm. Because calm was not weakness, and it was not passivity. It was the sound of a person who does not need to raise their voice, because the weight of what they are saying is sufficient. Claire Whitmore. 2 words. Just 2. His name for her, her full name, and the way they landed in the cabin was like something physical. They landed the way a door closing does when the person closing it is not angry, but is absolutely finished. "This is Dominic Ossie." A pause, and in that pause the name registered moved through the cabin. Landed differently in different people in Devon Ashby, who recognized it from the business coverage he'd followed. In Nora Beckwith, who had heard it somewhere and was now placing it. In the flight attendant Denise near the galley door, who went visibly still. And in Claire Whitmore herself, who had gone the specific gray of someone whose entire plan has just revealed a fatal assumption. You know that name, Claire. You have seen it on your pay stubs for the last 11 years. You have seen it on the letterhead and the company identification and the door of the executive office on the 42nd floor of Meridian Tower in downtown Atlanta. So, I need you to think very carefully right now about the last 4 minutes. The cabin had stopped breathing. The woman you just struck is my wife. The child she is holding is my son." He let that sit. He did not follow it immediately with anything else because it did not need to be followed immediately. It needed to be heard fully, completely by every person in that cabin and by the woman standing in the aisle who had made herself the agent of this moment. What you said before you struck her has been heard by everyone in this cabin. What you did has been recorded on no fewer than 3 passenger devices that I can see from where I am sitting. Across the aisle, Devon looked at his phone and then looked toward where the voice was coming from 3 rows back, and then looked back at the screen and kept filming. "Captain Flores, I need you to be aware of what has occurred in the forward cabin of this aircraft. Please note the time." Another pause. Dominic's voice, when it resumed, had not raised in pitch by a single fraction, had not taken on any of the textures that anger adds to a voice. It remained perfectly, precisely level, and that levelness was the most commanding thing about it, more commanding than volume would have been, more final than fury. "Claire, you are done for the day. Step away from my wife. Do not speak to any other passenger on this aircraft. When we land, there will be people waiting for you." The intercom clicked off. 3 seconds passed in which no one on Flight 2241 made a single sound except Kofi, who had resumed his soft, searching murmur, the murmur of a baby who has been unsettled and is working his way back to contentment against his mother's chest. Then someone in row 4 started clapping. It was one pair of hands at first, tentative and uncertain. The kind of applause that isn't sure of itself yet, that is reaching for something and not quite finding the form, and then a second person joined, and a third, and within 10 seconds the entire first-class cabin was producing something that was unmistakably, genuinely the sound of people who have just watched something terrible happen and are reaching instinctively for the one form of expression available to them in their seats, the one way they can push back against the thing they witnessed and couldn't stop. It was real applause, not polite, not performative, the kind that comes from the chest rather than the hands. Claire Whitmore stood in the aisle and received it as though it were a series of blows, each one landing her composure, fracturing and then reassembling and then fracturing again in a sequence that was visible to everyone watching her, which was everyone. Amara did not look at Claire. She looked at Kofi, at his dark eyes blinking open, and up at her with the unfocused, wondering gaze of someone returning to a world that still made no particular sense, but that contained his mother, and therefore was acceptable, and at the small, perfect hand that had curled around her finger, without her noticing it, happen, and she breathed. She kept breathing. She focused everything she had on breathing, and on him. She was shaking. She could feel it in her hands and in her jaw, and in the long column of her spine, the deep post-adrenaline tremor of a body that has been through something and is only now beginning to process it. And she was working very hard not to let it show, because there were people watching her, and she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her that dignity, real dignity, the kind that lasts, was not what you performed for other people. It was what you protected for yourself. Dominic was beside her in 30 seconds, not rushing, not dramatic, simply arriving the way he always arrived, with the quiet, unhurried authority of a person who does not need to announce himself. And he crouched beside her seat and put his hand against her face, against the cheek that was still red and still stinging. And he said something that was not for the cabin, that was only for her. She told him she was okay, and then, because she had never in 4 years been able to lie to him about anything that mattered, she told him she wasn't, but she would be. He stood. He found Claire Whitmore with his eyes, and what was in his face when he looked at her was not something Amara had seen there before. It was something that went past anger into a place that was quieter and more absolute, and he told Claire to go to the galley and stay there for the remainder of the flight, and when they landed there would be people waiting for her. Claire nodded once, turned, and walked away, and Amara leaned her head back against the headrest and looked at the ceiling and felt with the clarity that comes only in the aftermath of shock that something in the back of her mind, some well-calibrated instinct that had protected her more times than she could count, was already telling her that this was not over, that it was just beginning. Claire Whitmore was not crying. She stood behind the galley curtain in the particular stillness of a person who is not reflecting on what they have done, but assessing what comes next, and her hands, when she checked them, were steady, which told her what she needed to know about herself in this moment. 23 years had taught her many things, and one of the most important was that the first minutes after an incident were not for feeling, they were for planning, because feeling was something you could do later privately when no one was watching and when the outcome was already established. But planning had to happen now fast, while there was still a story to be told, and while she was still the one who could tell it. She made 2 calls and sent 1 text in the first 8 minutes behind that curtain. The first call was to a woman named Becca Strand, someone who had a following of 190,000 people on social media, and a particular gift for taking events that looked one way and reframing them until they looked another way entirely, a skill she marketed as narrative strategy, and that functioned in practice as something considerably less neutral. Claire spoke quickly, giving Becca the shape of the story she needed. Told a veteran flight attendant 23 years of service harassed and then physically threatened by a passenger who had become aggressive and unpredictable, who had required firm handling, who had struck first. The second call was to her brother-in-law, who worked in digital production and understood certain things about video editing that most people didn't, specifically what a 9-second clip shot from a particular angle cropped at a particular moment and slowed down slightly could be made to appear to show even when it was not showing that thing at all. The clip existed. It had been filmed during boarding by a passenger in the row behind Amara, casually a travel vlog, the kind of thing people filmed without thinking much about it, and it had captured the moment Amara adjusted Kofi's carrier on her body, her arm rising and then settling in the seconds just before Claire's hand came down. From the front, from Devon's angle, from any angle that included context, it was obviously what it was, a mother repositioning her baby. From behind, cropped, tightly slowed to 70% speed and isolated from the 15 seconds before and after it, it looked to someone who had already decided what they were looking at like something else entirely. Claire had been told about this footage by the passenger who'd shot it, who had texted her in the galley, thinking he was being helpful, thinking he was providing evidence in her defense, and Claire had understood immediately what it was and what it could become. She sent it to Becca with 2 sentences of instruction. She put her phone away. She adjusted her bun. She stood in the galley with her hands folded and her breathing even, and she looked at the curtain that separated her from the cabin and from Amara Osei sitting in seat 2A with her child against her chest. And she did not feel guilt, and she did not feel uncertainty, and she did not ask herself the question that might have interrupted the plan, which was, what have I done, and what kind of person does it make me? She had asked herself that question once early in her career, when something similar had happened. Not the same, nothing quite like this, but similar in its shape, and the answer had been uncomfortable enough that she had decided not to ask it again. And over the years, the habit of not asking it had become indistinguishable from simply not needing to. The galley curtain moved slightly in the recycled air. Claire stayed where she was and waited with the composed, settled patience of someone who has already done the most difficult thing and now only needs to let the plan work. And there was something in that patience, in its completeness, in its absence of hesitation that was, if you had been there to observe it, more frightening than anything she had said or done in the cabin, because fury you can understand and even predict, but this particular stillness was something else. Something that had been practiced into being over a very long time, and the practicing of it had cost her something she could no longer feel the absence of. The wheels of flight, 2241, touched the runway at LAX, and Amara had not slept for a single minute of the flight. She had spent the descent in a state that was not quite panic and not quite calm, something in between, something that lived in the body rather than the mind. a low, persistent hum in her chest that no amount of slow breathing could fully quiet the specific feeling of a person who has been through something and knows somewhere below conscious thought that the through has not yet become the out, the other side. Kofi was asleep against her collarbone. He had gone back under 40 minutes after the intercom, settling into the deep, unbothered sleep of a person with a perfectly clear conscience and no understanding of terminal velocity, and she had kept one hand on his back the entire descent, counting his breaths in the way she had counted them every night for 6 months, the way that had become as automatic as breathing herself. Dominic had not moved from the seat beside her. Between the landing and the gate, he had made 3 calls. Quiet clipped, the kind where very little was said and a great deal was communicated, and between calls he had stayed close to her in that particular way of his that required no words, his arm warm against hers, his presence doing what his presence had always done, which was to remind her that she was not navigating the world alone. Devon Ashby approached before they reached the terminal door while they were still in the jet bridge. He introduced himself, briefly told Amara he had filmed the entire incident, that the footage was clear and unedited, that he wanted her to have it and would provide the original to whomever she needed. He pressed his card into her hand without drama or performance, the way you hand something to someone when the thing you're handing them matters and you want them to understand that you know that. Amara looked at him. Really looked at him the way she looked at people when she needed to understand whether they meant what they were saying, and then she thanked him in a way that went considerably beyond the words. Dominic got Devon's contact information before they reached the terminal doors. The doors opened. The noise hit them like something physical, a wall of sound that took a moment to decode because the brain encountering it first registered volume and then gradually parsed the individual elements within the volume. The chanting, rhythmic, and coordinated, which meant organized. The signs held at shoulder height, which meant planned. The sheer number of people pressed against the barriers beyond the gate, 60 or 70 at minimum, which meant this had been building while they were in the air. The signs came into focus one by one as Amara's eyes adjusted to the scale of what she was seeing. First class for first-class people, stop the victim narrative. We stand with Claire. Send her back. Send her back. Send her back. Amara stopped walking. Dominic's hand found her arm immediately. Don't stop, he said low and direct, eyes forward. Keep moving. How did they... She started. There's a video circulating, Dominic said. Not ours. His phone buzzed. His attorney had been texting for 4 minutes since before they landed. The 9-second clip. Already 700,000 views. Edited, cropped, slowed. Showing Amara's arm rising in the moment she adjusted Kofi's carrier, stripped of everything before and after, pushed by accounts with large followings and a clear and specific agenda. Out of context, it looked like something it was not. Airport security met them at the gate, not because anyone had called ahead to assist them, but because the crowd had triggered a standard crowd management response, and 2 officers flanked them through the terminal with the efficient, slightly uncomfortable professionalism of people managing a situation they had not been fully briefed on and were reading in real time from the same news feeds as everyone else. Amara walked without looking at the signs. She did not look at the faces pressed against the barriers, mouths open, certainty blazing in their expressions with the particular intensity of people who have watched 9 seconds of something and decided they understand it completely. She heard every word of the chanting. She felt it land in her body, and she did not let it show on her face because she had been taught that your face in a moment like this was something you could choose, and she chose. But what she had not been prepared for, what she was not prepared for, even after everything that had happened in the last 2 hours, even with all of her experience of moving through a world that sometimes decided who she was before she had a chance to say anything, was not the anger in those faces. Anger she understood. Anger made sense as a response to being deceived. What she had not been prepared for was the absolute conviction. These people were not confused. They were not working from incomplete information and waiting for more. They had watched 9 seconds, and they had decided completely and without reservation who the villain of this story was. They had filed her into a category and locked the door, and the category they had filed her into had nothing to do with who she was or what had happened to her, and the lock had no key she could offer them from where she was standing. She held Kofi tighter. He was awake now, looking around at the lights and the movement and the noise with wide, curious eyes, too young to understand any of it, too young to know that the world was already constructing a story about his mother, and she was not going to let that story stand, and she knew that, and she held on to the knowing of it the way she had held on to Kofi's back for the last 2 hours, steadily, completely, without letting go. The private airport security office was just off the main corridor, and they got inside and the door closed and the noise dropped away, and Amara sat down and Kofi grabbed a fistful of her hair, the way he always did in new environments, and she let him, and the small, ordinary weight of his grip against her scalp was the most real and grounding thing in the room. Dominic told her about the edited clip the way he always told her difficult things directly without softening, because she had asked him years ago to trust her with the truth, even when the truth was hard, and he had never broken that agreement. She said I was adjusting his carrier, and then she said it again because she needed to hear it in the air more than once, needed to hold it in front of her as the thing she knew to be true, while the world outside that door was telling a different version. He told her Devon's footage was already in Ingrid Moss's hands, that it was 47 seconds long and completely unambiguous. He told her there were witnesses, multiple from multiple rows, who had seen exactly what had occurred. He told her they had everything they needed. And then he said the sentence that reframed everything Claire did this fast, Amara. She had help. This wasn't improvised. She had been processing Claire until that moment as a person who had acted terribly and impulsively, who had let the worst version of herself out without thinking the way people sometimes did when they had been carrying something for a long time and finally found a target, and the understanding she had built around the slap was the understanding you build around an act of sudden cruelty, painful wrong, but comprehensible as a failure of restraint. What Dominic was telling her was different. He was telling her that the slap might have been a failure of restraint, but everything after it, the calls from the galley, the edited video, the crowd outside the organized chanting, was not a failure of anything. It was a plan. Amara sat with that for a moment, feeling the shape of it change in her understanding. She was making calls in the galley, she said slowly. That's what she was doing in there. Yes, Dominic said. The edited clip had reached 3 million views while they had been in the terminal. Becca Strand's account had pushed it to 4 additional platforms. 3 media outlets had picked up Claire's version of events as their primary narrative. One had published, "Airline veteran speaks out, I was assaulted, and no one is listening." The headline had 40,000 shares. Philip Sato, alone at his connecting gate with his laptop open, had seen the clip on his phone, the 9-second version, the one that made Amara's arm look like it had moved with intention. And for a moment, just a moment, something in him had pushed back against it, had offered the alternative of what he had actually seen with his own eyes from seat 2C. He had been right there. He had seen the lean-in. He had heard the words. He had watched Claire's hand move and watched Amara's face in the second after. He had done nothing then. And now, looking at the clip on his phone, he could feel the pull to do nothing again, to let the clip be what it was, to let the story go, wherever it was going to tell himself that he had been one person in a cabin of many, that other people would come forward, that it wasn't specifically his responsibility. He put his phone in his pocket and picked up his bag and walked to the gate. He would think about this later. He would think about it quite a lot. Back in the security office, Amara's phone buzzed an unknown number, a text, 5 words that arrived with the particular chill of something that has crossed from the realm of professional conflict into something more personal and more threatening. "We know where you're staying." She showed Dominic without saying anything. He read it twice, and his expression did not change in any visible way. There was nothing in his face that flickered or shifted, and then he was on the phone to hotel security within 10 seconds, and his voice in that call had dropped into a specific register that she had heard before in moments of real seriousness. Not louder, never louder, but denser, more concentrated, communicating the precise gravity of what he was asking without a single wasted word. They moved rooms within the hour, different floor, different wing, different elevator bank, and the reservation was under a name that wasn't theirs, and the room was accessed by a key card that had been issued to a contact Derek Walsh had arranged before they even arrived at the hotel. And still somehow, 3 hours later, a photograph of the hotel's exterior appeared on Becca Strand's feed. Not their room number, not their floor, just the building. Just enough. Amara sat in the new room at 11:30 p.m., with Kofi finally asleep in the portable crib Dominic had arranged, and she looked at the photograph on her phone, and she understood with a clarity that was almost cold in its precision that what was being done to her was not a reaction. It was a strategy. It was methodical, and it was escalating, and each move was designed not just to damage her reputation, but to shrink the world around her, to take away the ground she was standing on piece by piece, to make her feel that there was no corner of her own life that was still safe. She understood the strategy. She also understood that people who relied on strategies had by definition something to protect a plan that needed things to go a certain way, a structure that would hold only as long as the truth stayed buried. And the truth, Amara had learned over 34 years of living in it, had a way of finding its own level. Eventually, the way water does, the way light does, the way the things that are real tend to do when enough people decide to stop pretending they can't see them. At 2 a.m, Dominic was asleep in the chair across from her. His head tipped back, his breathing finally slow, his face in sleep, carrying the softer version of itself that she loved best, the version that existed before the day got to it, and Amara was in the chair by the window with Kofi against her chest and a cup of hotel coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and her phone face up in her lap, and she had not cried yet. She was aware of this. She had been running on the adrenaline and the backbone and the stubbornness that her mother had spent 20 years building into her, and none of those things had left room for tears, and she had been grateful for them, and she was still grateful. But she was also at 2 a.m, in a hotel room she had moved to twice to escape a threat, beginning to feel the weight of everything that had happened in the last 18 hours, settling onto her all at once. Claire's video was on her phone. She had watched all 3 minutes and 47 seconds of it in the dark with the volume low so she wouldn't wake Dominic, and she had not looked away once. Claire had removed her uniform. She had let her platinum blonde hair down. She had removed most of her mascara, not all, just enough, leaving a faint shadow beneath her eyes that read on camera as a woman who had been crying, and was bravely quietly pushing through, and she had sat at the edge of a hotel bed with her hands folded in her lap, and looked directly into the lens with the steady, practiced composure of someone who has thought very carefully about every element of what the person watching is seeing. "All I can tell you," Claire said in a voice that broke slightly on the second word, precisely slightly, "is what really happened. And what really happened is that I was assaulted. And no one is talking about that." Amara set her phone down on the armrest very carefully. "She's good," she said to the room, to the dark, to no one. "She's really good." The comments were already everywhere. She had made the mistake of reading them, the way you make the mistake of pressing a bruise because the pressing is a way of confirming that the hurt is real. And they were personal in the way that comments about black women tend to be personal, referencing things that had nothing to do with what happened on an airplane, reducing her to categories, using the particular language of people who had decided who she was based on 9 seconds of footage, and were now constructing an entire person from that decision. She had read 51 comments in 45 seconds before she put the phone face down. She did not cry. She came close. She could feel the approach of it, the specific pressure behind the eyes and in the throat that means something enormous is very near the surface. And then she did what she always did when she felt herself on the edge of something that threatened to pull her under, which was to make a list, not on paper, but in her head, of what she knew to be true. Devon Ashby's footage existed 47 seconds, original unedited, already in Ingrid Moss's hands, already authenticated. Nora Beckwith had seen everything from seat 4B and had left the plane with Devon's card in her pocket and the expression of a woman who is not finished. Dominic had been on that intercom. His voice was on every passenger recording from that cabin. His name was on the company. The truth was documented and witnessed and real, and it did not stop being real because someone had built a very efficient and very well-funded alternative to it. And Amara Osei, who had been raised by a woman who worked 2 jobs and still made time every night to sit at the kitchen table and tell her daughter that the world would try to make her small and that her job was to refuse Amara Osei, was not going to let the lie win simply because it had arrived faster and louder and with more resources than the truth. She pressed her lips to the top of Kofi's head and breathed him in the particular irreplaceable warmth of him. The smell of his hair that she had memorized completely, the weight of him against her chest, that was still even now the most grounding thing in the world, and she let herself feel fully and without managing it the shape of what had been done to her today. The slap, the words before it, the crowd in the terminal, the threat on her phone, the photograph of the hotel, the 51 comments she had read and the millions she hadn't, the arrest she didn't yet know was coming. All of it, the full weight of it, she let it move through her in the dark. She felt it. And then she set it aside. Because tomorrow, Claire Whitmore was going to discover something important about Amara Osei, which was that she did not stay down and that she had never in her life found a version of too difficult that she was willing to accept as a reason not to get up. She was already thinking about what needed to happen in the morning, already organizing the sequence, already planning with the clean, methodical focus of a former corporate attorney who had spent a decade being the person you called when everything had gone wrong and you needed someone to think very clearly about what came next, and she was going to be that person for herself now, for herself, and for Kofi, and for every woman who might find herself in a seat she paid for on a plane. She had every right to be on holding a child she loved with no one on the intercom. She was going to be that person, and she was going to start now, and she was going to win. Ingrid Moss arrived at the hotel conference room at 6 a.m. with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the expression of someone who had been awake since 4 and had spent the intervening hours doing what she always did when a situation required immediate and decisive action, which was to think carefully and move fast and not in that order. She was 51 years old and had been practicing civil rights law for 24 years, and she was widely regarded by the people who knew civil rights litigation from the inside as one of the sharpest minds in the field in the state of Georgia, and possibly beyond it, the kind of attorney who was known not for theatrics but for thoroughness, who won cases not by outmaneuvering opposing counsel in the courtroom, but by being more prepared than them at every stage before they got there. She shook Dominic's hand and then turned to Amara and did something unexpected. She took Amara's face briefly between both hands and looked at her with the direct, uncurated attention of someone who is actually asking the question rather than performing it. "You okay?" she said. "I'm functioning," Amara said. "Good enough," Ingrid said, and released her and turned toward the conference room. 4 people were already inside 2 junior attorneys who had been there since 5:30 with printed documentation and laptops open. Raymond Kwok, a digital forensic specialist who had been Ingrid's go-to for 6 years, and who looked as he always looked in the early stages of a complex evidentiary situation, like a person who had not slept and was experiencing this as a feature rather than a problem. And Kwosia Park, who handled media strategy with the focused energy of someone who understood that in the current media landscape, the first 12 hours were often more consequential than the following 12 months, and who had been working through the night on exactly that premise. Ingrid sat at the head of the table and covered the evidence landscape without preamble. Devon Ashby's footage was authenticated and secured 47 seconds, the full sequence, no ambiguity in any frame. The chain of custody was clean. This was the foundation. Then Raymond pulled up a screen, and what he described was not good. The cabin security footage, which should have provided corroborating evidence from a fixed angle covering the aisle from rows 1 through 5, had been flagged internally at 11:43 p.m. the previous night as part of what was logged as a routine maintenance review of the recording system. The problem, Raymond explained, was that this was not a standard protocol. It was not something that happened in the ordinary course of operations, and what it meant in practical terms was that someone inside Meridian's own infrastructure had used the flag as a mechanism to create a delay in legal access to the recording. Someone inside the company. Dominic's jaw did the thing it did when he was containing something very large behind a very controlled surface, and he said, "Who authorized the flag?" And Raymond said, "We're working on that." And Dominic said, "Work faster." 2 words, and the temperature in the room seemed to actually drop. The edited clip had reached 16 million views across 5 platforms. Claire's hotel interview had been viewed an additional 5 million times. Formal takedown requests citing falsified evidence had been submitted to the platforms, and Quesia, when asked about the response timeline, said a single word, generous, which said everything about how she expected the platforms to move. 3 media outlets were running Claire's version as established fact. One had published an op-ed calling for an investigation into the weaponization of passenger complaint systems against airline workers. The comments on every major platform were in Quesia's assessment, a war zone. 2 things needed to happen today, Ingrid said simultaneously without delay. First, Amara went on record. Not a press release, not a statement from Ingrid's office. Her voice, her face, her words, a controlled, pre-recorded interview with a national morning program that Quesia had a relationship with airing this afternoon, establishing the true timeline before Claire's version had any more time to calcify into accepted truth. Second, the police report was filed before Claire's people did it first. That window, Ingrid said, was closing. Before Claire's people. Dominic repeated. Claire's union had filed a formal grievance at 8 o'clock that morning, Ingrid said, claiming self-defense. They had the edited clip. They had a narrative. And they had submitted 45 minutes ago a formal request to the Los Angeles Police Department for an investigation into the assault of a Meridian Airlines employee, naming Amara as the subject. Amara stood up from the table, not in anger, but in the specific physical need to be upright while she processed what she had just been told. "They're filing against me," she said. "They're going to try." Ingrid said. Amara absorbed this. She looked at Ingrid across the table, and then she nodded one nod complete, and decided, and she sat back down. "Then let's move," she said. The police report was filed at 9:52 in the morning at the Wilshire Division. Ingrid beside Amara at every step the way Ingrid was, beside every client at every step when the steps mattered. Detective Ray Okonkwo had the particular energy of a man who had been doing this for a very long time and had arrived at a place somewhere past surprise, a professional, thoroughgoing neutrality that was not indifference, but was the careful opposite of performance. The kind of presence that made no judgment visible while it collected everything. He was professional. He was thorough. He took careful notes in small, consistent handwriting and asked questions that were specific and orderly and gave nothing away about what he was thinking. Amara told him everything from the moment she settled into seat 2. The sequence, the words, the sound of the slap. Kofi crying against her chest, the intercom, the terminal, the crowd, the threat on her phone, and she told it cleanly and directly, and without embellishment, without editorial, without apology for any part of it, the way her mother had always told her to tell the truth, as though the truth were sufficient in itself, which it was. What she did not know, sitting across from Detective Okonkwo in that interview room, was that 30 minutes before she walked in, 2 other people had walked into a different division on the other side of the city and filed a complaint. She would not know this for several hours. Back at the hotel, Kofi was on a playmat on the floor of their room. Dominic had procured it from somewhere from hotel services or a nearby store. She didn't ask, and he was engaged in the focused total concentration project of reaching for a plastic ring that was just slightly beyond his range, extending himself toward it with the determined energy of someone who has decided that the gap between where he is and where the thing is a problem he is going to solve. She was laughing at him, actually laughing the first time she had laughed in 20 hours when Ingrid called. She answered on the first ring. "They moved faster than I expected," Ingrid said, and the particular way she said it recalibrated the tone of an attorney who is adjusting her model of the situation, told Amara before the next sentence arrived that what came next was going to be significant. 2 LAPD officers were on their way to the hotel. They had a warrant. Claire's union had filed a counter-complaint simultaneously with the grievance that morning, and they had found a judge who had acted on it within 3 hours. Which was not, Ingrid said carefully and clearly, standard. That speed was not standard. Someone had made a call. Someone had called in a favor. A warrant for what Amara's voice was flat and precise, the same flatness she had kept in her voice since the plane, because she had learned a long time ago that fear in your voice gave other people permission to make the fear bigger. Assault of a transportation employee, based on the edited footage, based on 2 witness statements from employees who had been in the galley at the time of the incident and who were claiming they had heard sounds consistent with Amara initiating a physical confrontation. They were in the galley, Amara said. They couldn't have seen anything from there. "I know that," Ingrid said. "And we will prove it, but right now this morning we have a window and we need to move through it." She paused. "Do not resist. Do not argue. Do not say anything when they arrive except that your attorney is present." "Amara, do you hear me?" "I hear you," Amara said. A pause. Then, quietly, "You're going to be okay." "I know I am," Amara said. And then, because it was the truth, "I'm worried about Kofi." That was the thing that broke through, not the warrant, not the charges, not the understanding of what was being done to her and how deliberately it was being done, but her son on the floor reaching for a ring 6 months old, who could not be left alone, who needed his mother and whose mother was about to have to walk out of this room. She called Dominic in the 4 seconds before Ingrid's call had even fully ended. He answered on the second ring. She told him in 4 sentences. The silence on his end lasted exactly long enough for her to understand that he was doing what she always did, compressing the feeling, finding what needed to happen next, storing everything else. "I'm coming up," he said. "Whatever is downstairs can wait." He was there in 4 minutes. Derek Walsh, the security consultant, had arrived at 7:30, with the quiet, unhurried competence of someone who had been doing this for a long time and understood that the job was to make the people you were protecting feel less alone in whatever they were facing, not more managed. He took Kofi with a gentleness that was practiced and genuine simultaneously, and Kofi, who was normally selective about strangers, assessed Derek's face with the solemn, wide-eyed judgment of a baby who takes these decisions seriously, and apparently decided he was acceptable because he allowed himself to be held without protest. Ingrid arrived 14 minutes before the officers. She went through everything, what to say, what not to say, where to stand, what Dominic should and should not do, with the quick, thorough precision of someone mapping every variable in the room simultaneously. When the knock came, the 2 officers were professional and clearly aware that this was a call that was being watched, and they read the warrant aloud, and Amara listened to every word without moving. She looked at Dominic. He was holding it together. She could see what it was costing him, the white edge at his jaw, the particular excess of stillness in his hands that meant he was working very hard, and he was doing it for her the way she had been doing it for herself all day. "I'll be fine," she said. He put his hand against her face. The cheek, the one Claire had hit. She turned her face into his palm for just a moment, and then she straightened. "My attorney Ingrid Moss is present and will accompany me," she said clearly. "I want that noted." And she walked out of the room. The arrest photo was taken at 4:44 in the afternoon in the processing area of the Wilshire Division, and by 5 o'clock it was on every major platform. And by 5:15 it was the top story on 4 networks, and the headline, "Black Woman Arrested After Allegedly Attacking Meridian Airlines." Flight attendant was being shared by accounts that had been sharing Claire's version of events for 16 hours with the energy of people who believe they are watching a story confirm itself. Amara in the photo was composed, her chin at the slight elevation she had carried since childhood in difficult moments, her back straight, her expression the expression of someone who has decided that the face they show the world right now is something they can choose. And it did not matter how composed she looked, because the people who had already decided who she was looked at the photo and saw what they had already decided to see. The holding cell was a room that existed in a very specific register of time where hours moved differently than they did outside, slower and more complete, where there was nothing to do except sit with what you were carrying and let the carrying of it become the only task. Ingrid was 3 feet away through a barrier with a legal pad that was filling steadily with notes, and she checked in every 45 minutes and gave Amara the facts. As they developed, Kofi was safe, Dominic was in the hotel, Devon's footage was secured, Nora Beckwith had been located and had agreed to provide a formal affidavit. The truth was still the truth, regardless of what any warrant said. Amara sat with her back against the wall, and she thought about her mother. Her mother had raised her alone. Her father had left when Amara was 4 in the particular way that some people leave, which is gradually, and then completely, and then definitively. And she had worked 2 jobs for most of Amara's childhood, the day job and the evening job, the one that paid the rent and the one that paid the tuition. And she had done it without complaint, because complaint was not the language she spoke, and this was the part that Amara returned to. Most often she had still found time every night to sit at the kitchen table and go over homework and ask how the day had been, and tell her daughter the things she needed to know. The most important one: the world will try to make you small. Your job is to refuse. Amara had been refusing all day. She was going to keep refusing. The refusing was not going to stop because of a warrant or a holding cell or 51 comments or a crowd with signs, because the refusing was not a reaction to any of those things. It was something older than they were, something that had been built into her structure before any of this had happened, and they could not touch it. At 8:47 in the evening, Ingrid came to the barrier with something different in her face. Not relief, yet, but the first loosening of tension that Amara had seen there in 12 hours. A very slight easing around the eyes that meant something had moved. "Nora's post is going viral," Ingrid said. "Real viral. The kind that's bringing in journalists, not just commenters." She paused. "And we may have a source inside Meridian. I can't say more yet. But Marcus is working on it, and it's significant." Amara looked at her steadily. "How significant?" "The kind that changes things," Ingrid said. Amara absorbed this. She thought about Claire in the galley making calls with steady hands. She thought about the edited clip pushed by accounts with large followings reaching 16 million people before she even landed. She thought about the judge who had moved on the warrant in 3 hours, which was not standard, which meant someone had made a call. Someone had built this. Someone with resources and access and a specific enough purpose to invest this level of effort in the construction of an alternative truth. Networks had nodes. Nodes had names. And names once found were considerably harder to hide than edited video footage. "I'm going to be out of here tomorrow," Amara said. "Not a question." "Yes," Ingrid said. "You are." Amara leaned her head back against the wall of the holding cell and looked at the ceiling and thought with the clean, unhurried clarity that comes when you have stripped everything back to the essential she was going to find out who built this. And she was going to take it apart, piece by piece. And she was going to do it not just for herself, but for the next woman, and the one after that, and every woman who would ever find herself in a seat she paid for on a plane she had every right to be on with no one on the intercom. She was going to do it because it needed to be done, and because she was the one who could, and because the truth, the stubborn, unglamorous, persistent truth had people in it, and she intended to be one of them. Theo Banks was 27 years old, and had been with Meridian's IT department for 3 years, and had been sitting in the server room since 9 o'clock the previous evening, since the call from Gary Noel at 11:15 p.m. the night of the flight, telling him to apply the maintenance flag to the forward cabin recording from Flight 2241 and not ask questions. He had done it. He had done it because Gary was his supervisor, and because it was late, and because Gary had said it was a routine request, and because he was 27 and scared, and because the combination of those things had added up in the moment to compliance, and he had gone home after, and he had slept badly, and he had woken up to the news. He had watched Claire Whitmore's hotel interview. He had watched Amara Osei's arrest photo move across every platform. He had read Nora Beckwith's Facebook post. He had read it 3 times, actually, because Nora wrote the way certain people write when they are describing something they saw with their own eyes, and need the reader to see it too, which is carefully, unhurriedly, with the specific details that could only come from someone who had actually been there. He had been in a server room at 11:15 p.m., following an instruction, and the instruction had been to hide the footage that would have shown the truth. He copied the original recording to a personal encrypted drive before the flag could be extended or the footage corrupted. He copied the access log showing Gary Noel's instruction, the exact words, the timestamp, the authentication credentials that confirmed who had issued the command. He created 2 backups stored separately because he understood enough about how these things worked to know that single points of failure were where important things disappeared. Then he opened his personal email account, not his company account, his personal account on his personal phone connected to his personal data. And he composed a message to a journalist he had known in college, a woman named Diane, who was now at a major investigative outlet and who had pressed her card into his hand at a reunion 3 months ago and said, "If you ever see something that shouldn't be happening, call me." He emailed instead of called. Safer. Less traceable, easier to document. He described what he had been asked to do. He described the footage he had copied. He told her he was scared and that he was sending this because he had read Nora Beckwith's post 3 times, and because the person in the arrest photo had done nothing wrong, and he had been asked to help hide the proof of that, and he was not going to do that anymore. He hit send. He sat in the server room in the particular silence that follows an irreversible decision. The silence of someone who has made a choice that cannot be unmade and is discovering in the aftermath of it that the fear is still present, but the certainty is larger than the fear. And the certainty is this: he did the right thing and he did it anyway, and he is going to have to live with what comes next, but he is not going to have to live with what would have come if he hadn't. The cursor blinked on the sent message. Theo Banks, 27 years old, alone in a server room in Atlanta, scared and waited for morning. Nora Beckwith got home to her house in Pasadena at 9:15 in the evening and made a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table and watched Claire Whitmore's hotel video on her laptop, all of it from the beginning without looking away once. She was 63 years old. She had worked as a registered nurse for 30 years in emergency rooms and ICUs in places where the truth was frequently the most important thing in the room, and where the people who told it clearly and without embellishment were the people who saved lives, and the people who softened it or avoided it or shaped it for a more comfortable reception were the people who didn't. She set her tea down. She opened a new post on Facebook. She began to type. She was not someone who wrote on social media. Often, her granddaughter teased her about it, said her page was just pictures of her dog and recipes she'd clipped from magazines, but she had been a nurse long enough to know the difference between the things that were optional and the things that were not, and this was not optional. She wrote in complete, unhurried sentences the way she had always charted patient history, specific, sequential, without interpretation beyond what the facts required. She described Seat 4B. She described what she had seen. She described Claire Whitmore's face before the slap, not the face of a woman who had been provoked or threatened or frightened, but the face of a woman who had already made a decision and was executing it, and she described Amara's face after. She described the hand that stayed steady on the baby's back even while the cheek was red. She described the voice that stayed quiet when it would have been so completely understandable to raise it. She described what she had said to Claire and what Claire had said back, and she described the silence of the cabin in the seconds after the slap. The silence of 30 people who had just watched something happen and were trying to decide whether what they had seen was what they had seen. At the end, she wrote, "I am 63 years old. I have been in rooms where terrible things happened, and I have been in rooms where people pretended they hadn't. I know the difference. I was in Seat 4B on Meridian Flight 2241 today, and I am telling you, as someone who was there, as someone who watched it happen 10 feet away, as someone who looked directly at both of these women, that Amara Osei did nothing wrong. Nothing. And the woman holding a baby in her arms should not be in a holding cell tonight. She should be with her family." Nora had 600 friends on Facebook. By midnight, her post had been shared 190,000 times. By morning, it was at 430,000. By the time Ingrid mentioned it to Amara through the barrier at 8:47 in the evening, it had already found its way to every major news outlet in the country, and a significant number outside it. And the comment section, unlike the comment sections on every other part of this story, was full of people who were reading carefully, who were taking in the specific details, who were saying to each other, "Wait, if this is what she saw, then what are we looking at?" Nora sat at the kitchen table and her phone rang, and she let it ring a while before she picked it up, because she had been a nurse for 30 years and she had learned that there was no particular urgency to the aftermath of doing the right thing. The right thing had already been done, and the ringing would keep. Dominic Osei did not sleep. He sat in the hotel chair with Kofi against his chest and his phone in his hand, and he worked through the night the way he had worked through every crisis in his professional life, methodically following each thread to its end, before picking up the next one, moving without panic through the sequence of what needed to happen and what needed to be known. But this was different from every professional crisis, because every professional crisis had been about something he had built, and this was about someone he loved. He had started Meridian from a 6-plane regional carrier and a borrowed office in Atlanta, had built it over 14 years into a company that moved 380,000 passengers a week across 32 routes, had navigated FAA investigations and labor disputes and a global pandemic that had brought the entire industry to its knees, had sat across from senators and hostile shareholders and regulatory bodies, and had never once in any of those rooms felt the particular helplessness of tonight. Because in all of those rooms, the thing at risk had been something he had made. And you could make other things. And the loss of something you have made is survivable in ways that other losses are not. Amara was 12 minutes away. At 2:17 in the morning, Raymond called with the first piece of real information, not a confirmation, but a name and a number and a date. Gary Noel, IT supervisor, 11 years with Meridian. A wire transfer of $17,000 to a personal account, to an account associated with Gary Noel 4 days before the flight. 4 days before. Dominic set the phone down on the armrest and stayed very still. Kofi made a soft, settling sound against his chest, and Dominic pressed his lips to the top of his son's head and held that breath and let the full shape of what he was looking at land on him with the weight it deserved. This had not started on the plane. The plane had been the execution. The planning had started before he and Amara had even packed their bags, before they had arrived at the airport, before the gate agent had scanned Amara's boarding pass and welcomed her to seat 2A. The planning had started at a point in time when someone had made a decision that this was going to happen and had begun building the structure that would allow it to. Someone had known. Not just that he was flying to Los Angeles, that was in the company calendar, accessible to any senior staff member, but that Amara was coming with him, that she would be in first class, that she would be in seat 2A, that Claire Whitmore would be assigned to that specific cabin on that specific flight. Someone inside his own company had built this around his family. He called Ingrid at 2:21. She answered on the second ring, which told him she hadn't slept either. He said Gary Knowles' name. He said the number. He said the date. He listened to the silence on the other end that lasted exactly long enough for him to understand that she was moving through the implications at the same speed he had and arriving at the same place. "That changes the entire legal structure," she said, and her voice had shifted into the rapid, precise register she used when she was thinking several moves ahead simultaneously. "That's not a disgruntled employee acting on impulse. That's premeditation. That's conspiracy. That's potentially federal Dominic. I know what it is," he said. "I need Raymond's documentation in my hands before 8. "You'll have it by 6, she said. He hung up and looked at the city outside the window. Los Angeles at 2:30 in the morning, still lit, still moving, the particular quality of its darkness that was never quite complete. And he thought about someone sitting somewhere comfortable tonight, having watched the news coverage, having watched Amara's arrest photo cycle through every platform, and feeling something that might have looked from the outside like satisfaction. He thought about Amara in a holding cell 12 minutes away, sitting with her back against a wall, thinking about her mother refusing to break. He thought about Kofi, who would grow up and know this story. He made another call. The bail hearing lasted 11 minutes, and the judge granted release on Amara's own recognizance without requiring bail, partly because Ingrid had presented Devon's authenticated footage and Nora's signed affidavit before the hearing began, and partly because the judge had clearly, in the hours since the warrant was issued, been following the same news cycle as the rest of the country and possessed the acute awareness of someone whose position required sensitivity to the political weight of the cases they decided. Ingrid told Amara everything in the car, speaking with the clean, rapid efficiency she used when information was both important and time-sensitive. Gary Knowles, the wire transfer, the date, the amount, what it meant structurally for the case. Amara listened the way she always listened when something truly mattered, completely, with the full weight of her attention on every word, building the picture as each piece arrived, connecting what she was hearing to what she already knew. "Someone at the company set this up," she said when Ingrid finished. "That's what the evidence suggests." Raymond had also pulled the flight assignment records overnight, and Sandra Yuen, a scheduling supervisor at Meridian's Atlanta hub, had approved Claire Whitmore's reassignment to first-class duty on Flight 224, 13 days before departure, within 40 minutes of the request submission, outside the normal approval protocol. Another name. Another node. The car pulled up to the hotel, and Dominic was outside waiting Kofi in the carrier, against his chest, standing on the sidewalk with the simplicity of a man who needed his family back in the same space as him. And when Amara stepped out of the car, he crossed the 4 steps between them and held her with the specific quality of someone who has been afraid and is no longer afraid, because the thing they were afraid of losing is here in their arms, present and real. She pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed. Later showered, changed Kofi nursing on the bed while she sat against the headboard, and Dominic stood at the small desk with Raymond's printed documentation spread out in careful order. She asked the question she had been holding since the car. "How many people inside the company?" "At minimum 4, Dominic said. "Noel Ewan, whoever provided the money and whoever told them who to target and when." She looked at him. "Who hates you enough to build something like this?" It was the right question. They both understood it was the right question because this level of construction, the internal network, the financial payments, the premeditated assignment, the edited footage, ready before anyone had even disembarked, required not just motive but resources. And resources at this scale meant someone specific, someone with access and money, and a grievance sufficient to turn those things into action. Dominic named 3 people. Amara knew one of them immediately. Roland Vetch, former Meridian board member, removed 16 months ago after Dominic had uncovered financial irregularities in the accounts Vetch oversaw. Irregularities that had been corrected quietly without prosecution, without public exposure in the particular way that certain things are handled when the person involved has connections and a lawyer and a preference for discretion over accountability. Vetch had not been charged. He had not been publicly named. He had simply been asked to leave, which he had done quietly and which had apparently not been quiet enough inside him because humiliation, the particular private humiliation of being caught and allowed to leave without consequence, was in Amara's experience one of the most durable and underestimated motivators in the full catalog of human grievance. "How long to confirm?" she asked. 48 hours if the wire trail is clean," Dominic said. Amara looked at Kofi, who had fallen asleep mid-feed with the absolute boneless commitment to unconsciousness that only infants and the extremely exhausted could achieve, and she thought about 48 hours and what could happen in 48 hours while Claire was still free and talking and the edited video was still on 5 platforms and her name was still attached to a criminal charge that had been dropped but not yet explained. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Something made her answer. A woman's voice, young, not quite steady. The specific unsteadiness of someone who has been deciding whether to make this call for a long time and has finally decided and is now speaking before the deciding can reverse itself. She worked at Meridian, she said. She had information. She had known about what was being set up for 2 days, and she had been trying to decide whether to call, and she was calling now because she had watched Amara's arrest photo on every screen she looked at all day, and she couldn't not call anymore. She said Claire Whitmore was told Amara would be on that flight. She was told the seat number. She was told that if she could create an incident significant enough to damage Dominic Osei's public standing, there were people who would ensure she was protected afterward. Amara's knuckles went pale around the phone. She looked at Dominic across the room, and the expression on her face brought him to his feet. She asked for one thing, one concrete, verifiable thing she could give to her attorney. A long silence, longer than felt comfortable. Then Sandra Ewan, the woman, said, "Look at her email history from 3 weeks ago. She coordinated the scheduling piece, and she didn't do it alone. They all called him the architect." The line went dead. Raymond accessed Sandra Ewan's email history through proper legal channels, Ingrid pushing from the front, Dominic authorizing executive-level access simultaneously, and it took 4 hours. And what was in those 4 hours' worth of emails when Raymond finally had them was what he described on the phone to Ingrid as the cleanest evidence trail I have seen from someone who believed they were being careful. 3 weeks of coordinated correspondence, scheduling requests that moved Claire Whitmore's assignment without going through normal channels, confirmations of Amara's seat assignment in first class, specific, detailed, time-stamped. And a phrase that appeared in one of Sandra Ewan's internal messages in reference to Claire that Raymond read aloud twice because it was the kind of phrase that demanded to be heard more than once assessment of her suitability for the task. Not for the shift, not for the route, for the task. At the center of the correspondence was a recurring contact address. Routed, Raymond explained, through 2 proxy servers, which was the digital equivalent of someone wearing a mask and also standing in a different room. But when he peeled it back, when he followed the routing to its origin point, it resolved to a private email domain registered to a shell company in Delaware. The shell company's registered agent was a law firm. The law firm's primary client for the previous 9 years was Roland Vetch. Ingrid called Dominic while he was in the middle of his board meeting. He excused himself without explanation, one hand raised, no words. The gesture of a man who has learned that real authority requires no justification, and stepped into the corridor. He listened. He was quiet for 3 full seconds when she finished. "We have him," he said. "We have a strong chain of circumstantial evidence pointing directly to him," Ingrid said, with the precision of an attorney who understands the difference. "We need one more link. Something that puts his name on a direct instruction rather than a proxy." Theo Banks. Dominic said immediately. The IT analyst, his drive, the access log. If the instruction that flagged the footage came from a terminal connected to Vetch's communication system, I'm already in contact with the journalist, he reached, Ingrid said. She's cooperative. She wants the story, but she understands the legal priority. She'll hold everything for 48 hours. Get it done, Dominic said. He went back into the board meeting. He sat at the head of the table and he looked at the 12 people around it, some of whom had been with him for a decade, some of whom had been with the company longer than he had people. He had trusted with the operations and the strategy and the future of what he had built. And he thought about the fact that someone close enough to this table to know his wife's travel itinerary had helped Roland Vetch try to destroy his family. I need to address something, he said, and the room went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when Dominic Osei spoke with that specific quality in his voice, the quality of someone who is about to say something that is not negotiable. He told them what he knew. Not everything. Not the details of the evidence, but the shape of it, a coordinated action inside the company against a Meridian passenger who was his wife. He told them that in the next 48 hours he would know who had participated. When he knew, they would know. The response would be immediate and it would be complete, and it would not distinguish between the principals and the people who had made the principals' actions possible. He let it land. That's all I have to say about it right now, he said. Let's continue. The room was very quiet for the rest of that meeting. The Donna Park email trail and the encrypted drive from Theo Banks arrived in Ingrid's hands within 4 hours of each other, and what Raymond found when he worked through them together, the emails, the access log, the financial documentation was what he described on the phone to Ingrid at 3:40 in the afternoon, as the most complete picture of coordinated wrongdoing he had assembled in 9 years of forensic work. The access log showed that the instruction to flag the forward cabin footage had been issued from a specific terminal, a device registered to a property in Buckhead, Atlanta, associated with Roland Vetch, using stolen executive credentials that had been obtained from a Meridian server through a breach that, when Raymond traced it, led back to the same shell company in Delaware, the same law firm, the same 9 years of primary client representation. Vetch had not used an intermediary to issue the instruction to Gary Noel. He had issued it himself directly from his own device, which was either confidence or arrogance or both, and which from an evidentiary standpoint was exactly the one remaining link that Ingrid had said they needed. She called Dominic with 7 words. His fingerprints are on all of it. While this was happening, Philip Sato was at home. He had been home since the evening of the flight, and he had been watching the coverage the way you watch something that you are implicated in without having done anything wrong, which is with the specific discomfort of someone who understands the difference between innocence and complicity, and is not entirely sure on reflection which side of that line they are on. He had been in seat 2C. He had seen everything. He had heard the words and watched the hand come down and seen Amara's face in the second after, and he had done nothing. And he had told himself on the plane, in the terminal, in the car at home, over 3 drinks and a meal he didn't taste, that it wasn't his responsibility that other people would come forward, that he was one person in a cabin of many. He had watched Devon's footage authenticated and released in a brief clip by Ingrid's office as part of the legal proceedings, and he had watched Nora's testimony on the news, and he had watched Amara's arrest photo continue to circulate on 3 platforms that still hadn't processed the takedown requests. And somewhere around 10 o'clock at night, the thing he had been calling not his responsibility stopped sounding like what it actually was. And what it actually was a choice he had made to protect his quarterly upgrade cycle over a woman holding a baby. He opened his laptop. He found Ingrid Moss's firm website. He looked at the contact form for 11 minutes, and then he filled it out in 3 sentences what he had seen where he had been sitting, that he was willing to give a formal statement. He submitted it. He closed the laptop. He went to bed, and for the first time since the flight, he slept. The next morning, he came to Ingrid's office in person. Meanwhile, the anonymous caller, the woman who had told Amara to look at Sandra Ewan's emails, who had said the word architect and then gone silent, was Priya Mehta, 28 years old, 2 years in Meridian's communications department, which meant she had routine access to internal travel manifests, passenger rosters, and executive scheduling. She had been recruited into what she described later as a competitive intelligence network, framed to her by a colleague as routine monitoring of executive travel, victimless. Just data, just scheduling information. Nobody gets hurt. She had believed it because she had been told something she could believe, and because the alternative understanding what it was actually for was something she had not allowed herself to look at directly. She had looked at it directly when she saw the arrest photo. She came to Ingrid's office the afternoon of the board meeting with the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something they should not have been carrying and has decided finally that the weight of it is greater than the fear of what happens when they put it down. She told Ingrid everything she knew, the names, the dates, the specific data she had been asked to pull the colleague who had recruited her the way the request had been framed. She was specific and consistent, and when Ingrid asked her whether she would be willing to give a formal statement, she said yes, without hesitating, in the voice of someone who has already made the decision and is now simply describing the shape of it. Amara, in the hotel room, heard about Priya from Ingrid that evening. Not the name, not yet just the fact of her, just the existence of someone inside the company who had chosen to speak. She looked at Dominic. "He thought I was the softer target," she said. "He didn't know you," Dominic said. She looked at him for a moment. This man, the one who had put his hand against her face on the plane and said something that was only for her, the one who had been in the chair across from her at 2 a.m, holding their son while she was in a holding cell, the one who had built a company and a life and had never once in 4 years made her feel like anything other than exactly who she was. "He still doesn't," she said. The studio at 6:50 in the morning had the specific quality of a space that is in the process of becoming itself. The lights warming up the crew, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this enough times that the preparation has become a kind of choreography, and Amara walked into it with the sense of someone who has been preparing for a moment not by rehearsing it, but by living through the thing that made it necessary. She had sat on the edge of the hotel bed the night before and asked herself one question, the only question she thought mattered. What do you want people to understand? Not about Claire. Not about Vetch or the wire transfer or the warrant. About what had actually happened to an actual person in the actual world on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon on a plane going from Atlanta to Los Angeles. The answer had come quickly and clearly, the way true things tend to arrive when you stop trying to manage them. She wanted people to understand that this was not a story about a powerful woman surviving. It was a story about what happens when a very well-built lie runs into the stubborn, unglamorous, persistent refusal of the truth to disappear. The host was Diane Solis, 24 years in television, the particular gift of asking the question everyone was thinking in the way no one else had managed to phrase it. And she met Amara in the green room and shook her hand and looked at her with the direct, uncurated attention of someone who is actually present rather than performing presence. "Are you ready?" Diane said. "I've been ready since the plane," Amara said. She sat in the chair across from Diane with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her voice completely level, and she told the truth in sequence without embellishment, without editorializing, without performing grief or manufacturing anger. And the truth told that way without decoration was sufficient, because it was the truth, and the truth, when it is real, does not need to be made more than what it is. She described the flight. She described the words. She described the sound of the slap and Kofi startling awake against her chest. She described keeping her hands steady on his back while her cheeks stung and the cabin watched. She described the intercom. She described the terminal. She described the holding cell and what she had thought about in it. When Diane asked how it felt to sit in that cell with her name attached to charges she hadn't earned, Amara was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking, giving the question the weight it deserved. "I thought about my mother," she said finally. "She raised me alone, and she worked 2 jobs, and she sat with me every night at the kitchen table, and she told me the world will try to make you small. Your job is to refuse." She paused. "I thought about Kofi. He's going to grow up and he's going to know this story. He's going to know what happened to his mother on a Tuesday when she was holding him in a first-class cabin at 35,000 feet. And I want him to know that she didn't break not because she's anything extraordinary, but because she knew the truth, and she held on to it." The producer in the green room leaned forward in her chair. Diane's final question, what did she want the people who had believed the other version of this story to understand Amara, didn't hesitate. That they were lied to by someone who is very skilled at lying, she said, and being deceived doesn't make you a bad person. What you do when the truth comes out, that's what matters. The segment aired at 8:03 a.m. By 8:45, it had been clipped and shared 17 million times. By 9:15, 3 of the platforms that had been amplifying the edited clip suspended the accounts responsible, citing coordinated, inauthentic behavior, a phrase that meant in plain language that the accounts had been organized and funded to push a false story, and that this had been detectable all along, if anyone had looked carefully enough, and that 17 million shares later, someone finally had. At 9:47 in the morning, the DA's office in Los Angeles called Ingrid Moss. Ingrid was in the middle of a working breakfast with Dominic and 2 attorneys when the call came, working in the sense that the table was covered with documentation and the coffee had gone cold and no one had eaten anything in the last 40 minutes because the eating had kept being deferred in favor of the next thing that needed to be addressed. She listened for 90 seconds. She said understood twice. She said thank you once. She set the phone on the table and looked at Dominic. "They're dropping the charges against Amara," she said. "All of them. Effective immediately." The table was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Howard Dominic's lead attorney. 31 years in practice, a man who prided himself on emotional regulation in all professional circumstances, and who had, in 31 years, achieved it consistently, said yes under his breath, with a force that visibly surprised everyone at the table, including himself. Dominic picked up his phone and called Amara. She was in the hotel room with Kofi in her lap, watching the interview playback on the television with the sound low, watching herself tell the truth in 12 minutes, and wondering if it had been enough, if it had been what was needed, if the words she had chosen were the right ones. And then her phone rang, and she saw Dominic's name, and she answered. "They dropped it," he said. She went still. "All of it," she asked. "All of it." Ingrid just got the call. She breathed. She breathed for longer than was physiologically required, the specific kind of breathing her body had been waiting to do since somewhere over the Nevada desert 2.5 days ago, deep, real, uncompressed, the kind that fills the places that have been held tight for so long, they have almost forgotten what open feels like. Kofi grabbed her finger. He grabbed it with the complete, uncomplicated certainty of someone who has never doubted that it would be there. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said back. They stayed on the phone without speaking for another moment. And what that silence said between two people who have been through something real together is not something that translates to words, because it is the thing that exists on the other side of words. The place you arrive when you have used up everything language is capable of, and you find that you are still there together, and that is the thing that matters. "I'm not done," she said before she hung up. "You know that." "I know," Dominic said. "I know you're not." Philip Sato sat across from Ingrid Moss in her conference room, and he did not look like a man who had prepared what he was going to say because he had stopped preparing it around the 4th or 5th time he had started and given up. He looked like a man who had decided to simply be in the room with what he had done and to say it clearly and to accept whatever came next. "I was in 2C, he said. "I had a direct sight line to the entire aisle from rows 2 through 5. I saw everything." He described it in the specific sequential detail of someone who has been replaying it, the lean in the words, the sound. Amara's face in the seconds after the slap, the steadiness of her hands on Kofi's back, the way she had spoken quietly when every person in that cabin would have understood if she had not. He described his own response, which was to look back at his laptop. He described the cursor that stopped moving. He described the document that stayed open on his screen for the next 40 minutes, unread. He told Ingrid he had stayed silent because he had been afraid of losing his platinum status with Meridian. The upgrades, the priority boarding, the particular treatment that comes with 11 years of loyalty to a single carrier, and that he had been saying this to himself as an explanation since the moment it happened, and that he needed her to know he understood. It was not one. "An explanation describes what you did," he said. "It doesn't justify it." Ingrid listened. She did not offer absolution because it was not hers to give. She told him his testimony provided now would matter, and that the choice to give it even 2 days late was still a choice and still a real one. He signed the formal statement. His account of Seat 2C directly contradicted the two galley employees' claims he had been 10 feet from the galley door in a clear sight line to the aisle, and he had seen nothing that resembled what they had described, and everything that Devin Ashby's footage showed and his statement said so in precise, unhurried language. As he stood to leave, he asked Ingrid one question. Would Amara know he came forward? Ingrid said she would know. He nodded. He picked up his jacket. He walked out of the conference room and into the elevator and out of the building and into the Los Angeles afternoon, and he did not feel absolved and he did not feel forgiven, and he understood that those were not things that came from a conference room or a signed statement, and that the most he could say about himself right now was that he had eventually done what he should have done from the beginning, and that eventually was something, and that something, whatever it was, would have to be enough to start from. When Ingrid texted Amara to tell her Philip had come forward and provided a full statement, Amara read it twice. She thought about the man in 2C who had kept his eyes on his laptop, and about the specific cost of looking back up after you've already looked away, and about how much longer that takes than simply not looking away in the first place, and about the fact that he had done it anyway. She wrote back one line. "Tell him it counts." Roland Vetch was arrested at his home in Buckhead at 7:20 on a Thursday morning. Federal agents and 2 Atlanta police detectives arriving at the door of a house that was designed in every detail to communicate a certain kind of permanence and insulation. The kind of house that is meant to say that the person inside it is not the kind of person things happen to. He came to the door in a bathrobe. His attorney arrived 22 minutes later, 7 minutes too late, to prevent his client from saying 4 words to the lead agent that were subsequently included in the arrest report, and those 4 words were, "You can't prove anything." He was wrong about this in ways that would take the next several months to fully enumerate. Gary Noel surrendered voluntarily through his attorney the following afternoon in the particular quiet way of someone who has understood for some time that the thing he was hoping wouldn't happen was happening, and has decided that the manner of the ending is the only remaining variable he can control. Sandra Ewan had already been cooperating with investigators for 20 hours before Vetch's arrest. She had called Ingrid herself, not through an attorney, not through a formal channel, just called the evening after Amara's interview aired in a voice that was the voice of someone who had watched 12 minutes of another person telling the truth, and had felt the distance between that truth and what she had been part of collapse into something she could no longer hold at arm's length. Claire Whitmore was the last to fall, and she fell the hardest. After Amara's interview, she posted 3 more videos, each slightly more defensive in tone than the last, each drawing fewer views, each generating a comment section that was shifting in real time from support to skepticism to something that looked increasingly like anger directed not outward but back at her. And when the DA's office announced the dropped charges against Amara and simultaneously confirmed an active investigation into the circumstances surrounding the original complaint, the last structural support for Claire's version of events gave way all at once, the way structures do when the load-bearing element has been quietly removed. She was charged with assault, filing a false police report, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. She turned herself in through her attorney on a Friday morning. There were no cameras outside the station where she arrived. There was no organized crowd. There was just an attorney and a client and the quiet, unremarkable machinery of accountability making its way through the steps it was always going to make its way through, just more slowly than it should have. Becca Strand deleted her account the same morning. Theo Banks was not named in the investigative piece that Diane's journalist Contact published 48 hours after the legal proceedings were advanced enough to allow it. At his request relayed through Ingrid and honored without argument, he was referred to only as a source with direct knowledge of internal communications. The piece ran on the front page of the digital edition and was by any objective measure one of the most carefully reported stories of the year. Amara sent Theo a handwritten note through Ingrid's office. She wrote 4 sentences because she had never been someone who over-explained the things that mattered most. You didn't have to. You did anyway. That kind of courage is the thing that actually changes how the world works. I won't forget it. She never heard back. She didn't need to. She already knew what it would have said. Claire Whitmore's trial lasted 9 days, and Nora Beckwith testified on the 6th one. She took the witness stand in the particular way she did everything without hurry, without performance, with the grounded, completely present quality of a woman who has spent 30 years in rooms, where what mattered most was telling the truth, clearly and calmly, regardless of who was listening. And she described what she had seen from seat 4B in the same unhurried sequential language she had used in her Facebook post, the language of a nurse who charted what she observed rather than what she wished had happened. She described Claire Whitmore's face before the slap. She described the expression on it, not fear, not reaction, but something that had been present before. Amara said a word. Something that had been decided in the galley and carried into the cabin, and applied the moment Claire stopped beside seat 2A. She described the sound. She described Amara's hands on Kofi's back in the seconds after steady, steady, while the cheek was red and the cabin was silent and everyone who had been watching was deciding what they had just seen. She described her own response, standing, speaking, saying what she had said, and she described what Claire had told her in return, and she said it in the same even precise voice, and she let it sit in the room without embellishment, because it didn't need any. When she stepped down from the stand, 3 of the 12 jurors were visibly crying. The judge called a 10-minute recess. Claire did not testify on her own behalf. Her attorney had advised against it correctly because the 47 seconds of Devin Ashby's footage, which the jury had watched in complete silence 4 times, represented a gap between the narrative Claire had constructed and the reality that had been recorded that no cross-examination technique in existence could bridge. The jury deliberated for 7.5 hours. Amara was in the courtroom when the clerk read the verdict seated behind the plaintiff's table. Dominic on her right, Ingrid on her left, Kofi with Derek in the courthouse corridor, and she was completely still while the words were read, the specific stillness of someone who has been waiting for a long time for a door to open and is standing very close to it now. Guilty on all counts. The room did not erupt. It released it, exhaled slowly and collectively, the way a room does when something has been held for a long time and is finally at last allowed to be set down. Not triumph. Not celebration. Something more complex and more human than both of those things, the particular emotion that real justice produces in people who understand that it is always late and always imperfect, and that it matters anyway. Amara looked at her hands in her lap. Then she looked at the ceiling. Then she looked at Dominic, and what passed between them in that look was not something that needed words. It was the recognition of two people who had come through something real together and had arrived at the other side of it still themselves, still each other's, and that was everything. Roland Vetch's federal conviction came 6 weeks later, conspiracy and wire fraud 4 years. His attorney called the sentence disproportionate. The 12 jurors who had deliberated for 11 hours said nothing publicly which was their right and which said everything. On the day of Vetch's sentencing, Amara was not in the courtroom. She was home. She was on the kitchen floor with Kofi, who was 8 months old now, and had recently made what appeared to be the most thrilling discovery of his life so far, which was that if he pushed against the ground with his feet, while his mother held his hands, his entire body rose upward into a position he had not previously occupied, upright, balanced, teetering, and he found this so extraordinary and so worth repeating that he had been doing it with complete and focused dedication for the last 20 minutes. Each repetition approached with the same intensity as the first. She was laughing. Not the managed polite laughter of someone in a social situation, but the full, involuntary, completely undignified laughter of someone whose body has found something genuinely funny and has stopped asking permission first. The kind of laughter she hadn't heard from herself in months. The kind that lives in the chest and takes up space and doesn't worry about who's watching. Kofi looked at her when she laughed with the wide, serious attention of a baby who hasn't quite decided yet whether laughter is a signal or a weather pattern, and she laughed more, and he grabbed her fingers more firmly and pushed with his feet again, and rose up wobbling, and looked at her as though she had arranged this, as though the fact of his standing were something she had given him. She had. In a way, she was still learning how to understand she had. Dominic came through from the living room doorway and stood watching them for a moment before she noticed him. His phone in one hand, the specific expression she had learned to read on his face, that meant something was settled. 4 years, he said. She looked up. Kofi wobbled. She steadied him without looking. Good, she said. Not theatrical, not triumphant. Just the clean, grounded satisfaction of someone who fought for the right thing and watched it land, and who is now sitting on a kitchen floor watching her son stand up. Dominic sat down beside them, and Kofi immediately redirected his ambitions toward his father's watch, which was apparently the most interesting object in any room it occupied. The civil suit, Dominic said. Filing date confirmed. I know, Amara said. Ingrid called. He looked at her the way he always looked at her when he was asking a real question, not the comfortable version, but the actual one. Are you okay with how long it's going to take? She sat with that for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved. She thought about taking the quiet version, stepping back, letting the legal process run without her name attached to the front of it, accepting that the charges had been dropped and the arrests had been made, and allowing the institutional machinery to handle the rest from a distance. She understood the appeal. She had earned the rest. She thought about the woman who didn't have 47 seconds of footage from the right angle, and the one who didn't have a retired nurse in 4B who refused to stay silent, and the one who didn't have a husband who could reach an intercom. She thought about that woman on a plane in a seat she paid for holding a child she loved, with no one on the intercom, and no Devin Ashby in 3C and no Nora Beckwith already rising from her seat. If I take the quiet version, she said, there's another woman on another plane somewhere in the next year, and the story ends differently for her. And I know that now. And I can't unknow it. Dominic nodded, the slow, full nod of a man who loves his wife, not in spite of the quality she was demonstrating, but because of exactly it. Then we fight, he said. We already are, she said. 3 weeks after the verdict, a text arrived on Nora Beckwith's phone while she was standing at her kitchen window with her morning coffee watching the light do what it did in Pasadena in October, coming in low and gold and generous through the kitchen window, the kind of light that asks nothing of you and gives everything. The text was from Amara. It said, "Thank you for not staying silent. What you did changed things for me and for people you'll never meet. I hope you know that." Nora read it once. Then she set her phone face down on the counter and looked out the window at the morning light for a little while, and she thought about seat 4B and the sound of a slap and a woman's hands steady on a baby's back, and she thought about having stood up and said what she said, and about what it had cost, which was very little, and what it had been worth, which was everything. She picked up her phone and typed back, "Honey, I was a nurse for 30 years. The only time I ever regretted speaking up was the time I didn't. Go live your life. You've earned every bit of it." In a server room in Atlanta, Theo Banks was at his desk doing his work, not with the particular tension of someone waiting for consequences, but with the ordinary, slightly caffeinated focus of a person who has made a hard choice and come out the other side of it, still himself, which was the most he had hoped for and which turned out to be sufficient. He had not heard back from Amara, which was fine. The note she had sent through Ingrid's office had said what needed to be said, and he had read it 3 times and filed it in a folder he kept on his personal drive, and occasionally he thought about it, and occasionally he thought about the cursor blinking on a sent email in a server room at 2 a.m., and he thought that was probably the moment that mattered most, and it was already in the past, and the past was where it was supposed to be. And in a kitchen in Atlanta on a Thursday morning in October, Amara Osei was on the floor with her son. Kofi was 8 months and 12 days old, and he had refined his standing practice into something approaching a discipline. He rose, assessed the situation, wobbled, corrected, and looked at his mother with the astonished, wide-eyed expression of someone who cannot believe this is possible every single time it happens, which was every time without exception. She held his hands. He pushed against the ground. He rose. He looked at her, those enormous dark eyes, her mother's eyes, the eyes that had looked at her since the day he was born as though she were the entire world, and she felt the whole weight of the last 3 months move through her all at once, the way you feel the full weight of something. Only after you have put it down, the flight, the slap, the words, the holding cell, the morning she had sat in the chair at 2 a.m. in a hotel room she had moved to twice and made a list of what she knew to be true. The truth had people in it, and the people had held. And here was Kofi standing in the kitchen that she had come home to in the house where the front door had been repainted in a new shade of blue. Not the old one restored, but something adjacent to it. Something that was not restoration, but continuation. Chosen deliberately because she was not interested in going back. She was interested in going forward, and she was laughing, and he was standing, and the October light was coming through the window, and outside the city was going about its ordinary life, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been told at 35,000 feet by a woman with platinum hair and 23 years of practiced contempt that she did not belong there. She was here. She had always been here. She would always be here. No one had ever come close to taking that from her. Not for a single moment. Not ever. Kofi wobbled. She caught him. He laughed, and Amara Jackson laughed with him, and the morning held them both, and that was enough, and it was everything. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We tell these stories because the truth deserves to be heard, and because the people who hold on to it, even when it costs them everything, deserve to be remembered.